Well, we've been going through this series in Jesus' parables this summer, and I've been loving it. I don't know about you guys, but I love the parables. There's nothing like a story to just stick in your mind and engage. And to kick us off this morning, I'm bringing us back. How many of you remember the stories of Robin Hood? All right, good. It's not too... So Robin Hood came from Nottinghamshire, which is a real place in England, and he popped up around the 1300s. And Robin Hood lived in this woods with his band of robbers, and they would attack rich travelers as they passed through the woods. And he was infamous, right? Because he would take from the rich and give to the poor. And it's kind of a weird dilemma, an ethical dilemma, isn't it, in this story? I mean, we tell this story to our kids, and it's a little bit confusing because, on the one hand, Robin Hood, I mean, if you're just looking at it from a black and white perspective, he's a criminal, right? He's attacking people. He's stealing money. He's, in some stories, killing people. But then if you think about it in terms of Robin Hood as this vigilante that's really out to help the poor, he's a hero. He's kind of like Batman, right? He doesn't fit into all of the rules. He's kind of a shady character, and yet, at the end of the day, he achieves some good results. Well, that's kind of like our parable today. This is one of the most confusing stories Jesus told. And it's because the main character in our story is a bit of a shady guy. And he doesn't fit neatly into all of the rules. He's rough around the edges. He's maybe even a little bit sinful. And yet at the end of the day, what Jesus is focusing on is the end results. And so look with me in Luke chapter 16 this morning, if you have your Bibles. If not, we'll have the verses up on the screen for you. Starting in verse 1, it says, Jesus said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, because you can no longer be manager. So, you've got this guy who's been living life easy. He's been living in luxury on somebody else's tab. And while he was supposed to be taking responsibility to steward his master's finances well, he's wasting them. He's probably wasting them on himself, if I had to guess. Now, how many of us know people like that? That are supposed to be taking responsibility, and yet they're wasting what they're supposed to be taking responsibility for. If any of us have ever been a teenager or have a teenager, you can probably think of a situation like this, right? And I just heard on the news last week a story about in a Middle Eastern country, the president's wife is being prosecuted because accusations were brought against her that she was wasting government money because she had spent over $100,000 on takeout, even though they had a private in-home chef. And that is a ton of takeout. I mean, think of how many pizzas that would be. Think of how much Chinese food that would be. $100,000. And while Uber Eats probably loved having her business, the taxpayers that were footing the bill and trusting her to be responsible with their resources probably did not. And when I hear this story, I just have to laugh because it's so ridiculous. And it seems like people that have it all, I mean, having a private in-home chef, they just always go a little too far, don't they? Their greed kind of just motivates them to take one step too far, and they get themselves into trouble. And that's kind of what happened with this guy in the story. Which goes to show you that Jesus' words are just as relevant today as they were when he first said them. Because while a lot of things have happened in 2,000 years, people have really stayed the same. The human heart has not changed. And so, pick up with me in verse 3. The manager makes a plan. He says to himself, "What should I do, since my master's taking away the management from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what I'll do, so that when I'm removed from the management, people will receive me into their houses." So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. He said, "Take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. And then he said to the other, "And how much do you owe?" He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, "Take your bill and write 80. You see what he's doing here? He's using his last precious minutes while he still has a job to get in good graces with his master's business partners so that they will owe him one once he's out on the street. I'm not entirely sure if this would have been legal or not, but either way, once it's done, it's done. And no matter what you think about the guy, you got to hand it to him. He's smart, right? I don't know that I would have thought to do that. And yet that's, weirdly enough, what the manager or the master says when he finds out what his manager has done. Because Jesus ends the story in verse 8 saying the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, which is kind of weird. But you got to hand it to the guy, right? He thought on his feet and he saved his own skin while at the same time making himself and his master look generous. In one last, what do you call it when it's at the end of a fireworks show? Finale. One last finale of a PR stunt. He plays a Robin Hood. And he makes some drastic price cuts to these guys' debts so that they would return the favor when he needed it. Now, we've already seen that this manager is kind of a shady guy, right? He's prideful because he's too ashamed to beg. And he's selfish, right? He wasted all of his master's possessions. And Jesus calls him a dishonest manager. So he's not that great of a guy, and yet his self-centered greed motivated him to be generous. He knew that you needed to spend some money if you wanted to make some money, and that you needed to give first if you ever hoped to receive. He knew that if he did good things to other people, that would actually serve his own best interest. But let's be real, the money he was being so generous with wasn't even his own money, which is always easier to be generous with other people's money, right? I was just listening to, I was in a group of guys this week, and one of the guys was sharing about going on a business trip, and he stayed at a Ritz-Carlton. And he was going on and on about how fancy his room was, and the view that he had, and the food that he ate. And then one of the guys was giving him a little grief because he stayed at a Ritz-Carlton. And he said, well, it wasn't on my card, right? It was a business trip. It's always easier to spend other people's resources and to be generous than it is with your own. But this is Jesus' story. A dishonest guy gets fired for wasting his master's possessions, and so he goes behind his boss's back and he makes all these unauthorized price cuts in order to make friends for himself who are going to pay his way once he's out of a job. And as I read this story this week, I thought about what Pastor Randy keeps saying about these parables. Sometimes you just got to go, huh? I mean, what is the point What's the moral in this story? You know, it's like, is it even supposed to be in the Bible? Because how are we supposed to apply that to our lives? Especially when the hero of the story seems to be this ancient insider trader. Well, if we keep reading, I think that Jesus gives us a couple clues about what the point of this parable is. So pick up with me in the rest of verse 8. Jesus says this, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light are. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." So Jesus ends his story here by comparing two groups of people. On the one side, you've got the sons of this world. These are people like this dishonest manager. And on the other side, you've got the sons of light, which are supposed to be the followers of Jesus, Christians, people like us. And he's comparing the two groups. And so many people get mixed up with this parable because we think Jesus is saying, you need to be like this dishonest guy in that you should be dishonest. But that's not what he's saying. Instead, he's saying, I don't want you to be dishonest like this guy, but I do want you to be shrewd like he is. I want you to be prudent. Jesus is saying, look at this greedy guy. Sure, he's motivated by self-preservation, but he knew that if he was generous to other people, that would go well for him. So how much more should the sons of light be generous, not because they're wanting to get something out of it, but just because we're generous? Or Jesus is saying, look at this guy. If he can make friends through his dishonest generosity, then how much more should we make friends through our honest generosity and be welcomed into eternal homes? Let me give you a modern example. Think of the world of business. It seems like every company has, they do good things for the community, right? Whether it's going green or donating to charities or building a new park in a poor neighborhood, companies like to do good things for the community. In part, I'm sure because they're good things to do, but also because they know that to do so would be good for business. Right? They're a company. At the end of the day, they want to sell more of their products. And while they know that being generous and blessing the community is good for the soul, they also know it's good for their bottom line. In an article that I read this week, it said that 70% of millennials would willingly pay more money for a brand that supports charitable causes. And with millennials being a $2.5 trillion worth of spending power, companies pay attention to that. And so I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they serve the community in order to sell more of their products. And I think Jesus would look at that, and he would look at it in a similar way as how he looks at this guy in this story. That if a secular company can be generous and bless the community, then how much more should the church be generous and bless the community just because we love our neighbors? Now, I want to recognize that there are a lot of people in this room that are very generous. I have been astounded at the financial generosity and the generosity of time that people give in this church. And so I want to give you a disclaimer that if that's you and you are financially generous, don't tune me out. Because the fact is, God calls us to be good stewards of every resource that he's given to us. And we all have parts of life that are kind of off limits, right? We've all drawn a line in the sand and we said, I will be generous, I will give of myself up until this point. And so, if you are financially generous, I want you for the rest of the sermon to be considering the other ways that God might be asking you to be generous, whether that's with your giving up some of your me time in order to serve, or whether it's giving up some of your possessions. Personally, it's very difficult for me to loan out my books. Megan will attest to that. So that's an area I need to grow in. It might be a possession of yours, or it might be a skill that you have that maybe you use all week during your work week, and then when it comes to the church, that's the last thing that you want to do. Maybe God's prompting you to be generous in some other area. So consider that, because the fact is, we all struggle with generosity in some area or another, right? We might be generous in one part of life, but we hoard in another part of life. Megan and I are celebrating our 2nd anniversary today. Thank you. And while marriage has been amazing, it's been such a source of joy and delight, it has also done an excellent job of showing me how selfish I can be. Just last weekend, when it was like 100 degrees, we went to the Whitecaps game. And I wanted to stay for the fireworks show. And Megan did not, because it was insanely hot out. And I pulled out all the stops. I pouted, I huffed and puffed, I gave her the silent treatment, all because I wanted to see the 5-minute fireworks show while my poor wife was miserable. And that just goes to show we can all be selfish in so many ways. And much like marriage, our use of money tends to highlight our selfishness. It shines a spotlight on the ways that we can be selfish. But why is that? Why are we so selfish? Why don't we, as followers of Jesus, why don't we follow him in his sacrificial way of life? Well, especially when it comes to money, I think there's 2 big reasons. Entitlement and fear. I mean, think about it. We earned what we have, didn't we? We went to college, we got a job, we punch in and day out, and we earned that paycheck. And now that we got it, it's ours. And we don't like when other people tell us how to spend it. We earned what we have, but soon this sense of entitlement makes its home in us, and we start slipping down the mudslide of selfishness. Or think about fear. Fear says that if I give now, what if I don't have enough for me when I need it later? Right? We feel secure when we have money in our bank account, or a plan B set up, or an insurance policy that's going to cover everything. We feel secure as long as we're in control. And while planning for the future is a good thing, I'm not saying it's not, our fear of scarcity often paralyzes our giving, while at the same time mobilizing our selfishness. But what does God have to say about these excuses? Look with me in the book of James. He says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming from the Father of light. You know what that means? That means that every single good thing that you have was a gift to you from God. That means that your paycheck, your job, the ability that you have to go to school, the good people in your life, your ability to speak or to write, your next breath. It's all been a gift to you from God, a gift, not earned, but given. And as for fear, look at Matthew 6. Jesus says, "So do not be anxious, saying, 'What shall we wear, or what shall we drink, or what shall we eat?' But the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you." God is our place of security. He is the one that we get hope from in the future, not our cash. You see what's happened when we allow entitlement and fear to inhibit us from giving? We've stopped listening to what God has to say, and we've started listening to something else. And when this happens, we're not just being stingy or missing the mark or treating ourselves. We're being idolatrous. We've replaced our God with something else. And the really ironic part is that the thing that we've replaced God with has "In God We Trust" stamped across it. And if you think I'm being too harsh, look back with me at Luke chapter 16. Because right after Jesus finishes this story, he says this. He says, "No servant can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." So when it comes to giving and generosity, the real question is not how much, but the real question is, in your heart, which master are you serving? Like the master or the manager in this story, the time has come for us to stop wasting what we've been given. For soon we're going to have to turn over the books, and we're going to have to give an account of our stewardship to our master. Will God be pleased with your stewardship of the money and the time and the resources and the personality that he's given to you? Will he look up from reviewing your bank accounts and your time logs and say what we hope he's going to say, which is, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? Will you be commended for what you've done with what you've been given? Jesus is inviting us today to serve God with every single thing that you have. It's to lay down your life for his sake. It's to drop your nets and follow him. And part of that is living a generous lifestyle. And we do this because he first did it for us, right? God so loved the world that he gave his only son so that we can have a relationship with him, so that we can live the life that he designed for us to live. Jesus didn't hold back when he saw that we were in need, but he came and he gave himself because he loves us. And we get to follow him in that selflessness. And if we're honest, it's only because we know his love for us, because we know that he's going to provide for us and care for us, that we can be generous without fear, without a sense of entitlement. So, practically, how does this look? How should we give this week? I want to give you a couple of ideas of how we can live this out and use all of our resources in order to be a good steward. First, give of your time. it might be helpful to spend a little bit less time on electronics, watching TV, playing video games, scrolling through Facebook, and give of your time and your attention this week and invest in your face-to-face relationships. Maybe it's asking your spouse or asking a close friend what they think about the world, or sharing what your favorite memory with that person is. Or maybe it's talking to your kids about the last movie that they saw and what they liked about it. But give of your time and your attention and steward it well. Or maybe you need to give of your energy and some of your comfortable preferences and pack some healthy snacks for lunch. Go for a walk. Get your steps in. Give of your time, of your energy, and steward your body well as the gift of God that it is. But lastly, I want to encourage you to give of your finances. Support this church and the work that God does here week in and week out. And make a plan to give of your finances. And if you miss a week, we've got online giving. But give and steward what God has given you well. Be generous with people in need. And as we practice this giving and this generosity, I believe that God's going to bless us and He's going to shape us to look more like Jesus, right? This is a practice that Christians put in their life. It's just one area, but it's a way that we can reflect Christ better. We're going to live more free, more joyful, more present lives if we're generous. Jesus doesn't tell us to give because He wants us to be miserable. He tells us to give because that's where life is at. If you really want to live, you've got to give up your life. And when we give, we're putting our faith in God, and that's exciting. We're telling God that you are our God, not our money. And it's not always going to be comfortable or easy, but it's going to be good. God's challenge from His Word today is not to make us feel guilty and part with our money, but it's a call to take the next step in a journey of faith and to believe that it really is more blessed to give than it is to receive. As my wife and I walked around South Haven yesterday, celebrating our anniversary, we kept going in all these shops, and I kept seeing all these things that I wanted to buy for myself, and Megan kept seeing all these things that she wanted to buy to give to other people as gifts. I want to be more like that. I still have a long way to go, but inSpirit, if a greedy crook can give, how much more can we steward everything God has given us for other people's good and for His glory? Let's pray.